Thank you very much. First off, I removed a term from the title of my speech because I realized that I need more time to explain the sort of groundwork of what I'm talking about. There was a word in there I called mentabolism, where I wanted to talk about the insights we can gain about cognition from the theory of metabolism, and I'm happy to talk about that later if anyone's interested. But for now, I'm going to use Uexküll's notion of Umwelt in order to try and arrive at a conceptual distinction between the Endo and the Exo perspective, by which I mean the view that the organism has from its subjective experience as distinguished from the view of the scientist who looks on the organism from the outside, because I believe that this is a distinction that is not made enough in philosophy and in cognitive science mostly, where it is widely confused with the difference between inside and outside of the organism. So the question, why am I here at this conference about biosemiotics, if I'm interested in the question of mind, is that I find Uexküll, who's such an important figure for biosemiotics, to be one of the most interesting and promising theorists for addressing this question. And one way of phrasing it is to ask whether mind is a pattern in the world or an experience of the world. And what is at stake here to me is what we mean by mind, how we talk about it, and also to some degree whether we are able to talk about it at all. And there are very different outcomes depending on whether you assume that mind is a pattern in the world or whether you assume that it's an experience of the world. And two examples of these are from phenomenology. Merleau-Ponty says, "I am not the outcome or the meeting point of numerous causal agencies which determine my bodily or psychological makeup. I cannot conceive myself as nothing but a bit of the world. I am the absolute source. My existence does not stem from my antecedents, from my physical and social environment. Instead, it moves out towards them and sustains them, for I alone bring into being for myself the horizon." So here we have a very strong emphasis on the subjective experience of the person speaking or writing to us. And in contrast to this, I chose Gregory Bateson from the cybernetic perspective. "And last, there is death. But if mind is immanent not only in those pathways of information which are located inside the body, but also in external pathways, then death takes on a different aspect. The individual nexus of pathways, which I call me, is no longer so precious because that nexus is only part of a larger mind." And to me, the contrast between these two is remarkable, and I'm personally very concerned about the individual nexus I call me. So I'm trying to figure out how to make sense of these very different approaches to mind. And the most helpful figure to me is Jakob von Uexküll, because I believe that he's almost unique in addressing both of these perspectives in a very sophisticated manner. His conception of the Umwelt is described like this: "We begin such a stroll on a sunny day before a flowering meadow in which insects buzz and butterflies flutter, and we make a bubble around each of the animals living in the meadow. The bubble represents each animal's environment and contains all the features accessible to the subject. As soon as we enter into one such bubble, the previous surroundings of the subject are completely reconfigured. A new world arises in each bubble." And bubble here means Umwelt, which is just a very imagistic way of describing it to us. So this is the Uexküll's version of the subjective experience of the organism, the perspective the organism has of itself and of the world. And he also has a very sophisticated view of the scientist's perspective from the outside on the organism, which is sort of proto-cybernetic. It's sometimes called functional cycle or function cycle. I didn't find all of the translations of Uexküll's work too appealing, but I went with this one here. And we can see on the left-hand side the actual physical environment of the organism, and then the world as it is sensed goes into the receptors of the physical organism. And on the right-hand side, we have what we would call the nervous system. At the point in the middle where it says new cycle, Uexküll is transitioning here in theoretical biology from simple organisms to more complex ones. And the simple ones only have a direct connection from the mark organ to the action organ, so from sensing to acting. And more complex organisms have this sort of internal feedback loop in their brain. So what's special about this is that he takes seriously both of these descriptions, and he talks about the way that they are linked to each other, what happens inside the bubble, inside the Umwelt of each animal, depends on what goes into this functional cycle, which features of the environment can be indeed received by the sensory organs and so on. But he also maintains their sort of conceptual autonomy and integrity. And before I can develop these two views into a systematic way of talking about it, I want to look more closely at the notion of Umwelt, because I believe that most people who interpret this notion are doing some sort of conceptual damage to it, more or less. And the question is whether Umwelt is open or closed. And I found a remarkable overlap between very different people. If you look at the German edition from the 50s, the introduction makes an exception for humans, arguing that because humans possess rationality, their Umwelt is not closed. They all agree that animals' Umwelten are closed, but humans are an exception. And then in Dorian Sagan's introduction to the English version that came out 8 years ago, he makes a similar argument. He uses different points, but he agrees that humans are an exception to the idea that animals have a closed Umwelt. And then there's a large field of Exo-Reception in what is called philosophical anthropology, and Herder's sort of a forerunner of that, who came a lot earlier. But the main figures are Scheler and Plessner, who sort of established the field, and Gehlen. And I've mostly read secondary literature about them, but the way Brentari describes is that philosophical anthropology argues that only humans are open to a significant world made of language, science, symbolic forms, abstract knowledge, cultural traditions, and so on, while animals are closed in their environment, Umwelt, and limit themselves to reacting to those stimuli and objects which pass through the filter of their receptor organs. And then in Herder's description, here basically what Brentari describes is humans having an additional faculty in language and symbolic communication that allows them to go beyond what animals do. And it's sort of the reverse in Herder, because he says animals are fitted very well to their environment and their instincts allow them to do everything they have to do in order to survive, but humans lack this. Our bodies aren't very powerful and our instincts are not enough to solve all the problems we encounter, so we have to engage in cultural problem solving and so on. And this lack, what he calls orphans of nature, is basically also the reason why we are open to the world in his account. And then there are different views on this. Brad Buchanan, for example, uses other parts of Uexküll's oeuvre to argue against the closeness of Umwelten. You can see it in the word harmonious whole at the end of the quote. You sort of have a ring of Uexküll's idea that life is like a symphony where everything resonates with each other, but I believe that applying this to Umwelten is sort of a mixed metaphor that doesn't work very well. And then Sagan's introduction actually says that language reflects an Umwelt larger and more sophisticated than that of any individual human, which I also believe to not be a correct use of the term language, because it's not linked anymore to an actual organism. And what all these commentators have in common to me is an attempt to escape from what one reviewer calls the cold prison of Umwelt. And I believe there's a strong aspect here of having sort of an emotional response to the idea of closedness and this being generally undesirable. But I will, in fact, argue that Umwelt is closed for humans, and also why this is the case. Umwelt, or the bubble, is closed because it is impenetrable from the inside. The organism cannot get out of its own Umwelt. It's also impenetrable from the outside. The scientist cannot actually step into the bubble, as Uexküll describes. The objects in the bubble are constructed, so they are not merely a selection of physical objects, but they have to be reconstructed by the nervous apparatus and turned into signs. The spatiality of the bubble itself is also constructed, so the spatial dimensions that an organism experiences are not actually the same as physical space. And then the question of sociology and symbolic communication. I agree that organisms are, of course, functionally coupled with not just with an environment made of objects, but also an environment made of other organisms. But I think it makes more sense to talk about this on the level of the functional cycles, because the Umwelten of each individual organism are still disjunct and detached from each other. I use the word transcendentally here. I don't actually talk about Kant in the presentation, but Uexküll was very explicit about his references to Kant and the idea that Umwelt is closed and a closed, more or less private construction of the individual is also because of these Kantian roots. Okay, so this looks a bit different. The first point about the bubble not being penetrable is that you cannot enter another Umwelt, you cannot leave yours. And that's partly because of the definition. Everything that is accessible to the subject is part of the Umwelt. So if I try to reach outside of my bubble, anything I can grasp is by definition part of the Umwelt, part of my bubble. So it's conceptually not possible. But also, if we think about what the bubble is as an image, we realize that it's basically a metaphor. It's an almost poetic description. And Uexküll didn't write it like this because he was a poet, he was a scientist, but because there is in fact no experimental setup that he could have described which would allow us to measure or observe the subjective experience of another organism. One reference here is Hans Jonas, who says that only life can know life. In his article, Is God a Mathematician? He's sort of going through a thought experiment. If God was a mathematician, whether or not he could have created creatures that have subjective internal experience, and his answer is no, God is not a mathematician. So there is Brentari is very, very good about this, very explicit in arguing that some people talk about Umwelt as if it's merely a selection from the physical environment of some relevant aspects, and this is not the case. It's not enough. There is definitely selection. If you have different eyes, the eyes of a dog or the eyes of a bird or the eyes of a human, they have different abilities for being stimulated by wavelength. And then according to this, you can see different colors. So this is a selection. But we don't actually see wavelengths. We have experiences of color, and there are several steps between this. So the wavelengths of light have to be turned into neuronal spiking, and then inside your brain, more or less, the stimuli coming from the outside are translated into signs, and then these physiologically produced signs are transposed outwards. Uexküll calls it Hinausverlegung, and this is what I mean when I say that spatiality is constructed. It's not that we have a direct access to the physical dimensions of space, but it's that from the available input that our sensory apparatus is able to process, we create for ourselves a space that we live in. And we experience this as objective qualities of the world, but it is in fact a construction. And lastly, the argument against human exceptionalism in terms of our social and symbolic abilities. I go back to this quote by Brentari I had on before, and I highlight the contrast between humans who are open to a significant world and animals who are limited by the filter of their receptor organs. And if you look back at the perspective of the functional cycle, this makes clear that humans are also limited by the filter of their receptor organs. Language, culture, and sociality have to pass through exactly the same sensory modalities as everything else, and we have to construct the people in our social environment. We have to construct the books we are reading as meaningful signs in our Umwelt, just the same as the chairs, which are also physical objects but have meaning to us. There's no clear boundary between objects that are mere physical objects in our Umwelt, because everything we experience is meaningful to some degree. And there is no special organ that brings language in from the outside, and there's no secret entrance to the brain, basically. So what all of this means is also that we should not deflate this bubble. We shouldn't deflate the notion of Umwelt. I feel like many people who talk about Umwelt, but also, for example, when people who don't like phenomenology talk about it, they always focus on a very narrow version of it. I don't believe that Umwelt is a cold prison, because everything that you experience in terms of warmth and social interaction, love, this is all part of your Umwelt. Similarly, all the language and the symbolic culture that you're involved in, this is inside your Umwelt. So the bad news is that Umwelt is closed. The good news is that all the stuff you like and you are afraid of losing is actually part of Umwelt. But also, if we take into account the way that Umwelt is linked to the functional cycle, which crucially depends on the brain, it is important to not deflate what we mean by mind or what we mean by brain. So people say, oh, looking at the brain is not enough. If we want to understand cognition, we have to look at social interactions. And then I would say yes, but depending on the perspective you take, if you take the perspective of Umwelt, you have to realize that the social interactions that an organism is able to engage in from its own perspective have to be based on signs that the organism constructs in its Umwelt. So just because neuroscientists aren't able to show you where in the brain these social relations are turned into meaningful signs, it doesn't mean that it's not in there. Now that I've hopefully established that Umwelt is closed even for humans, I want to talk more about what I mean by endo and exo, where endo roughly means the perspective of the organism as it experiences the world, and exo means the perspective of the scientist. Or as Uxküll describes it, according to the physicist, there's only one real world. So this is my exo perspective. And the biologist maintains that there are as many worlds as there are subjects. So if the endo perspective is the world as experienced by a living being, every living being experiences their own world, which they construct and enact in their everyday life. Unfortunately, I came up with the idea of an endo-exo schema before I realized that lots of people had done this before. This happens quite a lot when you think about these interesting topics on the margins of philosophy and biology and cybernetics. You realize that someone in the 90s already did it. And this is where this diagram comes from on the right. There's actually 3 different versions of endo and exo in this one single picture in a book by Atmanspacher and Dalenort. But then additionally, there's Ture von Uxküll and Hermann Geiges who use endosemiotic and exosemiotic, but they also use it differently from how I use it, so maybe it's better to not actually read it, because that would be probably confusing. What's really important about endo and exo is that these are not 2 parts of a whole. So if you look at the inside and the outside of an organism, and this is also related to how Carl Friston describes the free energy principle. He says you have the organismic boundary, you have the inside and the outside. These inside and outside together are a whole world. But endo and exo are not, because they both describe the same reality, just from different perspectives. So if you have the exo perspective of the scientist, this is actually where the whole world is divided into inside and outside. But similarly, if you have the subjective experience of existing in an Umwelt, you also experience the inside of your body and the outside. So Carl Friston, for example, makes this mistake that he says the inside of the organism is a model of the outside, but you have proprioception, you can feel your stomach grumbling and so on. So the model that you are is actually a model of the whole world, the inside and the outside, not just the outside. And I believe that these perspectives are complementary in the sense that they are mutually incompatible. You can't really dissolve one into another, you can't reduce them into each other, which we'll see on the next slides. But also they are individually correct descriptions of the same state of affairs. So if each of those describes the whole world, they have to sort of account for the existence of the converse perspective as well. So exo accounts of endo basically means how scientists talk about subjective experience. Mostly this is not very satisfying. The whole debate about the hard problem of consciousness is very frustrating. But we can look at how Uxküll uses imagination basically and invites us to imagine what it would be like to step into the bubble, but we know that's not actually possible. And then most solutions are either arguing that it doesn't really exist or that it doesn't really matter, which would be something like epiphenomenalism. Then it says that it's just an illusion. And then there are other people who talk about mind and experience in ways that actually make it impossible to talk about it. For example, if you say that mental states are the same as brain states, then you don't really have the ability to talk about Umwelt anymore, because mind is just this 3-pound hunk of flesh. That's not very productive, I think. So what is the reverse? If we have an account from the exo perspective, how can we account for the existence of a scientific worldview? The way I think about it is that it basically involves disengaging yourself emotionally, cognitively, where you think of yourself as an observer who's very abstract, and so you sort of mute your own experience of being embodied, of being in a specific context socially, being at a time of day. That all that doesn't matter if you write science, and you sort of negate the subjective character of your thought act, be this reading, writing, or thinking, any objective description. And then there are nominalistic results of this, but I don't think I have time to go into that. Basically, the two different options. One of them is to say that my personal experience is the necessary foundation of any objective knowledge, like Merleau-Ponty does, and then you can do a more extreme thing, like Uxke, who actually says that the objective world is just a very translucent shadow image of all human Umwelten, and it does not have the least degree of reality on its own, which I think gets you into trouble. So I personally strive towards a sort of balanced view of Endo and Exo, where neither is against priority of the other. But what is important as a takeaway is that the Endo perspective spans open its own spatial dimensions. It's not located somewhere in exospace. So this is bearing, for example, on the idea of whether something is in the head or whether something is in the mind, which I think is somewhat misguided if you don't make this distinction between different perspectives, because your Umwelt is not actually located in physical space. It's not a bubble that floats around your head. It's its own physical space. So the processes that give rise to it are concentrated, I would argue, according to the functional cycle, in your brain. But the space that you experience is not the space in which the brain exists. And then you have the same argument basically for objects. If you talk about affordances, the objects that are meaningful for you and afford action possibilities are not the same as the physical objects. So in arguing for the extended mind, Clark and Chalmers talk a lot about a notebook that someone is using as part of their problem solving. My point would be that the notebook as a physical object is not part of a cognitive process. It is only as a sign in the Umwelt of the organism that the notebook becomes part of an act of thought. And then when we go back to this nice quote that Don Favreau had on the slides, where biosemiotics was charged with arguing that the immediate object of perception and experience are internal mental constructs rather than worldly objects as such, I would say yes, guilty as charged. However, the constructs are not internal in a narrow sense, but they are endo-constructs, and they are worldly, just not exo-worldly. So they belong to a world, just not the physical world. The immediate objects of experience are constructs which are externalized into the constructed space of a subjective Umwelt. In conclusion, Umwelt, properly understood, is a closed construction unique to each organism. The view from within a minded organism, Endo view, is fundamentally different and disjunct from the view on the minded organism from the outside, the Exo view. Endo and Exo are not partial descriptions, but complete, incompatible, and complementary descriptions of the same reality. The Endo-Exo distinction is crucially non-identical with the inside-outside distinction, and there is no neutral higher-order framework available which would allow us to choose Endo over Exo or vice versa, and any such choice, which people do indeed make, tends to apply the criteria that hold within the view which they favor, which is a point I didn't argue here, but I'm happy to talk about it in the break. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Elmo, we do have time for a few questions. If I can abuse my position as the mic holder, I want to go back to science, right? Because you make a very interesting point with that Umgebung as a shadow world, right?
Yeah.
And you also, talked about this very important point of science, right? A critique of science, so that we're not able to get in the mind of the bat, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, if there's this implicit critique of science that you're making, right, in terms of even from like a ethological or primatologist's point of view, which is trying to get near to the Umwelt of the organism, what's the alternative? And is there a Abstufung from different preferable ways of going about trying to figure out how these organisms are experiencing their world?
That's a tricky question. I mean, the main thing that I would like people to change about the way that they think about these questions is to take into account that these two perspectives are very distinct, and not to conflate them or to shift from one perspective to the other without being explicit about it, because I think that's the main problem I have with many existing ways of talking about mind, whether this is in cognitive science or in philosophy. And as concerns the criticism of science, There are parts in Uxküll where he is a lot more explicit about how science works as something that a scientist does in their Umwelt, but I haven't really delved deeply into these yet, so that's something I'd definitely be interested in looking at.
Tim, great talk. I'll keep this short because I think we share a lot of the same concerns. I'll just point out, historically, Uxküll was pure Kantian. He was continuing Kant's project, and he says this himself. For what it's worth in biosemiotics, Jesper Hofmeier made the point a long time ago that to have the kind of biosemiotics we want to do the things we want, you need to go from Uxküll's Kantianism to Peirce's semiotic realism. So just one way, you don't have to, one way to dissolve or to overcome this problem between the inner and the outer. Is there no me inside? Is there no outside out there? If you accept one scientific reality and two biosemiotic posits, you can do it. The scientific reality is that we are porous. We're more porous than we're not porous. This boundary is not as sharp as it may seem from our meso-level vision. When you look down on the microscopic level, there are exchanges constantly going on between inside and outside, and I know that's Exo and Endo are not identical with that in your model. But the other case is that if through these physical exchanges, there are also semiotic exchanges with the environment. If, as Aquinas says, the sign is a triad that has one foot in the world and one foot in the agent, and each contributes its own properties to it to make a third, then through this flow of signs, which comes in not just through the brain, but to every part of the body, the self is a genuine locus of sign exchange that is unique and is perhaps inaccessible in its without manifest expression to another being. But so the self doesn't dissolve, right? But it never leaves this constant interchange. This interchange is what feeds it and grows it and keeps it in being as a process. So there is a way of thinking about both the reality of what we would like to think of ourselves as lovers and thinkers and beers and individuals, and our complete and utter immersion with the outside world. And this is Peirce's semiotic realism.
I'm very much looking forward to talking more to you about this and to reading more about it. I must admit that I don't have a strong knowledge of Peirce, and I'm only just beginning to get into biosemiotics, as it were, but also this own conceptual schema of Endo and Exo that I'm trying to develop. I don't expect that I'm going to arrive at something that will be ironclad and that I want to stick with. It's more that I'm trying to sort of sound out the possibilities of thinking about this, and I'm fully expecting my own position to develop and change and hopefully become more helpful to me in thinking about these problems. That said, I feel like one point where it would probably be difficult for me to advance beyond my current position is the question of how these semiotic processes map onto subjective experience, which is part of my sort of, you could call it personal hang-ups, but also the direction where I come from in terms of my inquiries is not from biology, but it's from the basic problem of subjective experience often falling by the wayside, for example, in political philosophy and so on. So I believe that this would be the question I would keep in mind when reading up on Peirce, which I fully extend to do. And the other question, which I think is very interesting, is this topic that I left out here, which is I called mentabolism, because to me, many of the things you described sounded like they would help me a lot in developing this idea that we can understand mind by reference to metabolism. And I think spontaneously thinking about metabolism seems to me to give us an interesting sort of tension between exchange and boundary, because yeah, I have to think about it more, but I think it's a very interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elmo. We're out of time, but please give him a round of applause, and we can continue this conversation over